in the previous class, okay, we have said all the elements, the basic elements or the basic files that are required to develop a sample Hibernate application, where first we need to have a file with the name hibernate.cfg.xml, where we configure all the Hibernate information, Hibernate connection details and Hibernate specific properties, and we configure even the HBM files in the mapping tag. Okay, and the next thing is develop a POJO class which has all the attributes that we can map to a table. Okay, and the POJO class will be mapped to a table and the attributes will be mapped to a specific columns of a table. And the mapping, actual mapping will be done in the Hibernate mapping tag. Sorry, HBM file, where we call it as a Hibernate mapping file, and in the Hibernate mapping tag, in the class we configure a class to a table, and in the ID we will configure a primary key, and in the generated class is assigned, then the responsibility of primary key generation will be delegated to the application, and Hibernate will not take care of that. And if the property name equal to name and column equal to some column name. Okay, and non-primary key properties will be configured through the property tag. That's what we have learned yesterday. And in the client side, first we create a configuration object, and we'll create a session factory object on top of a configuration. The session factory should be only one per application. Just because it is a heavy object, and the session factory will take the configuration information and will create a session, okay, based on the configuration information, the database information and all the Hibernate properties. Based on all the database information and Hibernate properties in the configuration file, the session factory will create a session, and all the transactions will occur through the session. Okay, so we'll begin the transaction so that we are telling to Hibernate that from this point of time, the session is ready to perform some transactions. Okay, and save is a method which is used to insert the information. Okay, and commit the transactions, flush and close. And one more thing is, without a primary key we cannot map a specific table in a Hibernate mapping file. So if you want to map a table in a Hibernate mapping file, there should be a primary key. Just because in a class tag, ID tag is mandatory. In the ID tag we can configure only primary keys. So we should have a primary key in a specific table to map it in the mapping document, mapping file, HBM file. Okay, that's what we discussed yesterday. Now we have told that the configuration file is hibernate.cfg.xml. Even we can make the configuration file name to be different, like hu.cfg.xml. Okay, now if I make the file name as hu.cfg.xml, let me see by executing this application. Now, earlier Sharad, did you download the SQL developer? Did you install that? Okay. Where it is? Was it already there? It is fun. I think we need to download something which will support 1.5. Okay, for now it's not that much important. We shall use this only for now. Tomorrow we'll download another software. Okay, now person ID is 100, name is Ravi, 200, name is Ravi. Let me delete all the records. The 2 rows are deleted. Now there are no rows in this table. Now let me try to insert the rows. Okay. Let me try to insert one row through save method. And now my configuration file name is hu.cfg.xml. Now let's see, will it be accepted or not? Is it accepting or is it throwing an exception? It's telling like Hibernate.cfg.xml is not found. Now can we have the name of configuration file other than Hibernate.cfg.xml? Yes or no? Yes or no? The name of the configuration file can be other than Hibernate.cfg.xml, but by default the configuration object will consider only Hibernate.cfg.xml. By default, the configuration object will consider only a file with the name Hibernate.cfg.xml. But if we write the configuration information in another file which is other than Hibernate.cfg.xml, then here in the configure method we should specify this. Okay, by default we won't provide anything to the configure method, but if the configuration file name is other than Hibernate.cfg.xml, then we should give that file name here in the configure method. It's possible that the configuration file name is other than Hibernate.cfg.xml, but the thing is, while executing the configure method, we should provide that information that we have used a configuration file other than Hibernate.cfg.xml. Understood? Now let me execute this application. Now it is successfully executed. Okay, so the row will be inserted. Person name, something like this. Why? Resource busy and acquire with no weight specified. because we have opened two connections. One is from SQL and another is from, sometimes it happens. So this record is inserted. Now let me delete the records. Now the row is deleted. Now if I select, there are no rows selected. Now if I execute the application, why this is not database. Let me see this. Okay. What Hibernate is doing is actually by default it will, if it is a string, here the property is a string, this name is a string. So actually the length of the string by default Hibernate, what it will do means it will apply the 255 character length. Hibernate will apply 255 character length by default. So what it is doing, it's trying to alter the table so that the length is 255 characters. But we are specifying a fixed length, that whatever present in the table, we are specifying the same fixed length. This is better to do rather than altering it to 255 characters by default by Hibernate. Okay, just it is better to specify a fixed length. Okay, understood what the problem was? The editor was open, but the editor is open, but the Hibernate application is trying to modify it to some 255 characters, to alter it to 255 characters. Since the editor is open and it is altering the schema of the table, okay, it has not committed, the transaction is not committed properly. So I have fixed it by specifying the length to 30 characters. So in the database as well as in the Hibernate application, they are in sync now. Understood? then the Hibernate application will not alter it to 255 characters. By default, if we do not specify any length, Hibernate will alter it to 255 characters length for Oracle. Okay, so that's how it will behave. So I have specified a length, maximum length of this specific property to 30 characters. Now let me delete it again. There are no rows selected. Let me re-execute the application. Commit is one of the problems. Okay, that's not a big deal. And yes, but where we are, yes, configuration file. The name of the configuration file can be anything. Okay, any file, any XML file, but the name of the XML file should be configured in the configure method. Okay, and we can put it in any path. We need not to put in the local classes folder. We can put in any path, but we should specify that path in the configure method. Let's consider like if we specify hibernate.cfg.xml in some config folder. So now we should give that config / some cfg.xml. So whatever the path that we have for configuration file, that path should be given in the configure method. It should not be like configuration file should be in the same folder where the classes exist. We should give the same path where the configuration file exists in the configure method. Okay, but currently it is in the same folder, so we have just given the name. Okay, and next thing is already if you select the rows, there is one row with ID as 100 and name as Ravi. Now if we try to insert it once again, it is an exception. Okay, it's something like a constraint violated exception. Okay, just in some of the pages, please note down all the exceptions. Just dedicate one page for Hibernate exceptions. Okay, dedicate one page for Hibernate exception, just because in interviews, if you go for interviews related to Hibernate, they'll ask like what are the exceptions that you came up with. So if you list out them in separate page, then it will be easy for you to refer. Yeah, these are the exceptions that are occurred in this scenario. Now this exception r.hibernate.exception.constraint violated exception will occur when the primary key or not null key or unique key constraint is violated. Then what next? Now, if you want to update the information, I'll call the update method. Okay. If you want to update the existing records, I'll call the update method. So earlier the name was Ravi. Now I'll change the name to Prasad. Okay. Earlier the name is Ravi. Now I change the name to Prasad. Now let me execute this application. See the query update HUS person set name equal to something where ID equal to something. Okay. Now let me insert another row. Now let me give a record for Hibernate so that Hibernate performs update action. But does that row exist 200 Srinath or something? Only a person ID 100 and name is Prasad exists. But does the row already exist? Yes or no? No. Then if the row doesn't exist, let us see how the update will behave. Okay. Update HU person set name equal to something where person ID equal to something. Is that reflected in the database? No. Now if you perform an update action and if that row doesn't exist, will Hibernate give an exception? Yes or no? No. But it does not update the table. That's it. Hibernate will not give an exception in that case, but it will not update anything in the specific table. While performing update action, if the specific row doesn't exist, Hibernate will not give any exception. It will not update the information. That's it. Okay. And yeah, not on that point there. It's also important for interviews. Some of the interviews will be asking. Let's consider like I have executed the update method, but the row doesn't exist. What is the exception that is raised in this case? You need to tell that there is no exception raised in this case. Okay, the record will not be updated. Anything will not be updated. Nothing will be updated in that environment. In that case, that should be your answer. The interview questions may be direct or indirect. So in this case, there will not be any exception. But they'll ask like, what is the exception raised in this case? Don't think there will be exception raised and don't search for the exception. Don't think about the exception. Just think about a scenario where whether it gives the exception or not. If you are confirmed that it will give you exception, then think about the exception. Okay? The questions may be direct or indirect to test your depth in the knowledge. And now I have a requirement like if the record already exists, then I should update the record. If the record doesn't exist, then the record should be inserted. Okay? If that is my requirement. Understood my requirement? If the record already exists, then I should update the existing record. If the record doesn't exist, then I should insert the record. If that is the case, for that case also there is a method in Hibernate which is called as SaveOrUpdate. Okay, for that kind of requirement, there is a specific method in Hibernate session that is SaveOrUpdate. Either save or update. Update when already exists, save when doesn't exist.
Before this, reading the date condition is of the primary.
Yes.
Where the default of the primary is the way.
See, I was supposed to discuss that now, just after this execution. I'll tell in detail how it will happen. Okay, save or update. What it will do means it will save doesn't exist, update if already exists. Now, let me execute the application. Okay, sorry. Let us see the query, what it is happening. First, what it is doing, it is making is triggering is it visible? Yes. What is doing first? For save or update, it's performing a select query. First, it is selecting the information from the database. After selecting, Hibernate will verify whether that row already exists or not. Okay. If the row doesn't exist, it will perform the insert operation. If the row already exists, then it will perform the update operation. Now, after this transaction, whether the row exists or not exists, just because of this transaction, the row was inserted. Let me execute this again. Now select something, okay, select something, person ID, person name, from HCU person where person ID equal to something. Now whether the row already exists or not. Since the row already exists, nothing will happen. Now let me change the name from Srinath to Rajesh. Let me change the name from Srinath to Rajesh. Now, is the row updated or not? Is the update query triggered or not? Yes or no? Yes. Okay. The update query will be triggered only when there is a chance of updation. The Hibernate framework, what it will do means it is smart enough so that it will compare the objects present in the database as well as the objects that we provide. If it is the same, then it will not trigger any query. Understood? So now let's see the database. For 200 ID, the name is Rajesh. Okay. If I give Rajesh again, okay, and try to update, will it trigger the update query? Is it triggering the update query? No, just because the information present in this object as well as the information present in the database is the same. Hibernate is smart enough to compare those values with the POJO object and that of the database table. If it is the same, then it will not update. If it is different and if it is modified, then only the update query will be triggered. Now from Rajesh, let me change the value to Srinath again. Now the update query will be triggered. Just because earlier the value is Rajesh, then I am updating it to Srinath. Understood? If there is a possibility of updation, then only Hibernate will trigger the update query. Okay. If there is no use of updation, Hibernate is smart enough to compare the values present in the table to the values present in the POJO object. When there is a change, then only it will trigger the queries. Otherwise, there is the update query will not be triggered. Understood? Now, on what basis Hibernate will verify whether to save or to update. Understood my question? On what basis Hibernate will tell that yes, this row exists or this row doesn't exist? Let's consider that this is already a row with name Srinath and already there is a row with name Prasad. Now let me consider that I'll give another row with the name Prasad, but the ID changes. Okay. Now in this case, will Hibernate consider this as a duplicate row? No. Why? The name is the same, right? Prasad, and here also Prasad is there. Then why Hibernate doesn't consider this as a duplicate row? ID is different. Why Hibernate will take care of only ID? Why doesn't consider name? Just because ID is the primary key that is configured in the mapping file. So to verify whether the particular record exists or not, Hibernate will consider only the primary key column. Okay, if the primary key value already exists, then it is a duplicate record. If the primary key value doesn't exist, then it is not a duplicate record. Understood? That is how Hibernate will decide whether a particular record exists or not, only through the value of the primary key. If the value of the primary key, now in this table the primary key is the ID. Now if the ID exists, then the Hibernate will consider that it is a duplicate record. If the ID doesn't exist, then Hibernate will not consider it as a duplicate record, it will insert the record. So first it will select, it will verify whether it exists or not, then it will insert the record. Just because earlier 300 doesn't exist. So Hibernate, okay, will verify only the primary key column. Okay. For existence of a POJO object, okay, or for existence of a record, Hibernate will verify only the primary key. Okay, Hibernate will verify only the data in the, or Hibernate will verify only the value in the primary key column. Okay, the rest of the things will not be considered by Hibernate. Hibernate framework will consider only the value in the primary key column. If the primary key column is the same, then it will consider it as a duplicate and it will not update the insert or update the information. But if it is different, then the record will be inserted or updated. Understood? Understood everybody? So SaveOrUpdate will perform two queries. One is select. After selection, Hibernate framework will verify, okay, whether that record exists or not, okay, whether the record is the same or not. If it is the same, then it will not trigger any query. If it doesn't exist, then it will trigger insert. If it exists but some information is changed, then it will trigger the update query. If it exists but information is not changed, in that case will Hibernate trigger the query update? If the row exists but the information is not changed in the POJO object that we have given, then will Hibernate trigger any query in that case? No. For SaveOrUpdate, Hibernate will not trigger any query until the information is changed. Okay? Understood? That's how we can update the information in the database using Hibernate, either update or SaveOrUpdate. Okay? Some interviewers will be asking a question like, what is the difference between save and SaveOrUpdate? Or update and SaveOrUpdate? What do you answer? If I answer a question, if I answer the same question, what is the difference between save and SaveOrUpdate? Save will always try to develop an insert query, insert the information. But SaveOrUpdate, first it will select the information from the database with the specific primary key value. If it exists, then it will insert. Not exists, then update. Then what is the difference between update and SaveOrUpdate? The same thing. Okay, update will try to just update the information, but SaveOrUpdate will select the information based on the primary key. If exists, then it will update. If not exists, then it will insert the records. Now, let me try to update the information. Now, what is the value of what is the value with ID 300? Prasad. Now, I'm changing the value to Suresh. Okay, and then after flushing, what I'm doing is I'm changing the value to Sudhakar. Okay, understood what we have done? Okay, now what could be the value in the database? Will it be Suresh or Sudhakar? Suresh. Just because when we update the information, the value of the name is Suresh. Okay, now okay, now it happens like that. And what is the value? Suresh. Now let me give the same after executing the update method. Okay, after executing the update method. Okay, now what is the value? Sudhakar. But at the time of execution of update method, what is the value? Suresh itself. Okay, but let me do it after commit. But let me not set the name so that the value will be Suresh itself in the database. So now the value is Suresh in the database. Okay. Now after committing the transaction, what I am setting is I am setting the name to. Let us see. Okay. Now two update queries are triggered, and what is the value? Suresh. Now, if it is before committing the transaction, what is the value here? So now once we execute either save or SaveOrUpdate or any methods in Hibernate, okay, and after that if we change the value before committing, then those information will be reflected in the database. Okay, understood? Before committing, let's consider like we execute the update method, and because of update method some query is being triggered. Now let's consider that I'll enter star. Okay, I'll execute star. This I am updating to Suresh. Yes, I will commit the transaction. So now the value is Suresh for 300. Now what I am doing is This will after executing the update method, I'm printing some stars. Okay. Now let us see. So when the update query is being triggered, while executing the update method or while committing the transaction? While committing the transaction. So while committing the transaction, okay, then only the update query will be triggered. Okay, and once the update method is triggered, okay, our save method is triggered, or save or update method is triggered. Okay, once we execute any of the methods of the session with a specific object, understood? Once we execute any of the methods of session by sending or by retrieving any POJO object, that POJO object is said to be in persistent state. Okay, the POJO object, once it is associated with the session, then that POJO object is said to be in a persistent state. Okay, let me execute this application once. Is it reflected here? I have changed the name to Naresh, but is it reflected in the database? No, just because we have not committed the transaction. When we commit the transaction, then only the information will be permanently reflected in the database. Though the query is executed earlier, the information is not permanently reflected in the database. Now, the information is permanently reflected in the database just because we have committed the transaction. So, firstly, we need to commit the transaction, okay, to reflect it in the database. And one more thing, before associating a POJO object with the session, then the POJO object is said to be in a transient state. Okay, the POJO object before associating with the session, it is said to be in a transient state. Once the POJO object is associated with the session because of any mode, either select or insert or update, like save or update, or because of select operations. Because of any database operation, once the POJO object is associated with the session, then that POJO object is said to be in a persistent state. Once the POJO object is there in the persistent state, okay, the changes in the POJO object will be automatically reflected in the database. Understood? Once the POJO object is there in the persistent state, then the changes in the POJO object will be automatically reflected in the database. Here, just see here, okay, we have executed the update method. Now, when we execute the update method, a query will be built up internally by Hibernate. Okay, so that update something with some values. But after that, we are updating the name. But even this information will be updated in the database, just because the object now it is in the persistent state. After this 17th statement, the POJO object which is referred by the reference P will be there in the persistent state. After execution of update, before update up to 16th statement, this object will be there in the transient state. Once we execute the update method, since we have associated this POJO object with the Hibernate session, this will become an object with a persistent state. So once the object becomes once the object turns into persistent state, then whatever the modifications that we do, all the modifications will be automatically reflected in the database. Hibernate is such smart enough so that it will detect all the changes in the persistent state. Once the object is there in the persistent state, okay, whatever the changes that are done to the object, those changes are automatically reflected in the database. Understood? Then let's consider that we have set the name as Sudhir. Okay, now what is the information in the database? Sorry, is Sudhir updated here? No, just because, okay, once we update the name as Sudhir, the session is already closed. Okay, if the session is closed, then the POJO object associated, all the POJO objects associated with that session will come into a state where we call it as a detached state. If the session is closed, then all the POJO objects associated with that session will come into a state named detached state. Once the session is closed, all the POJO objects associated with that session will come into a state where we call that state as a detached state. And if we change the POJO object in a detached state, that information will not be reflected in the database. Only the change of the object that is done in the persistent state will be reflected in the database by Hibernate. The changes that are done in either transient or detached state will not be reflected in the database. The changes that are done in persistent state will be reflected in the database. Understood? Does anybody have a confusion regarding the states? When we call the POJO object as transient, when it will be persistent and when it will be detached? Understood everybody? By default, when we create an object, a POJO object, it will be in a transient state. When we associate the transient object, transient state, a POJO object with a transient state to a session object, either through save or update or save or update, or while fetching, while making a select operation. Okay, but any of the ways, if we associate a POJO object with a Hibernate session, from that point of time onwards, it will act as an object in a persistent state. So, in a persistent state, if you make any changes, the changes will be automatically reflected in the database through a Hibernate framework. Hibernate framework, what it will do means, it will try to sync the persistent object with the database. It will sync the persistent object with the database. And once the session is closed, the object, all the POJO objects associated with that session will come into the detached state. And in the detached state, if we change any information, that information will not be reflected in the database. Understood? That's how Hibernate states of POJO object in Hibernate. These are the three states of POJO object in Hibernate. It's a very important question. What is transient? What is persistent? Okay. What is detached? Transient and yeah, like if we consider it in the context of database updation, they behave the same, but they are not the same. If you think in the context of database updation, okay, transient as well as detached will not do anything. But detached is an object which was earlier associated with the session, but now it is removed from the session. Okay, and now if you want to remove, okay, an object from a session forcefully, then we'll execute a method named evict. If you want to remove an object from a session forcefully, that means if you want to send a persistent object to a detached state forcefully, naturally when it will come into detached state means when the session is closed. But before closing the session, if you want to forcefully change the state of the POJO object from persistent to detached, then we call the method evict. If you want to forcefully send a persistent POJO object to detached state, then we'll call the method evict. Understood? Now, what I'll do is I'll update the query so that name is Suresh. Now, here earlier the name is Naresh, and then after executing update method, I am changing the name to Sudhakar, and then I am evicting the object. Let us see what happens. Is the update query triggered? Is the update query triggered? No, the update query is not triggered. And then is the POJO object information changing from that of the database? Is the POJO object information, okay, different as that of the database? In the database with the ID 300 name is Suresh. The POJO object, the value is Naresh, and then we have changed it to Sudhakar. Is it different or is it the same? It's different. Just because here in the database it is Suresh, and here in the POJO object earlier it was Naresh, and we have changed to Sudhakar after updation. So, what is this? Is it eligible for updation? Is this POJO object eligible for updation? No. Why? See, ID is 300, name is earlier Naresh, then Sudhakar. Even Sudhakar is different from Suresh. So is it eligible for updation? Yes. Even it is eligible for updation, after executing this application, no update query is triggered and nothing is updated. Why nothing is updated and no update query is triggered here? Even it is eligible for updation? Just because we have executed session.evict. If we execute session.evict, what happens? That object, that POJO object will be forcefully converted into a detached object. Now it is persistent state. Up to this point of time, up to 20th line, it is in persistent state. Now, because of executing the evict method, the POJO object is turned into a detached state. Since it is in detached state, will it be updated in the database? No. So, the update query will be triggered only when we execute commit method. But before committing, what we are doing? We are evicting. We are evicting the POJO object. Evicting the POJO object is nothing but conversion of the POJO object from persistent to detached state. At the time of executing the commit method, is that POJO object in the persistent state or is that in the detached state? At 21st line, is that POJO object, is that POJO person object, is that in the persistent state or the detached state? Detached state. Since it is there in the detached state, will that information updated in the database? No. Just because detached objects will not be updated by Hibernate in the database. Okay? For that reason, this information will not be updated. If I comment this, will that information updated in the database? Yes, just because this is in the persistent state now. Now if you execute this, okay, update query is triggered, the information is also updated. Understood? What evict will do? It will forcefully convert the state of the POJO object from persistent to detached so that the information will not be updated. Understood? That's how it will be. That's how the states of the POJO object will be here. Now before closing the session, again, if you make session dot now, was the information updated in the database? What is the information now updated in the database? Will it trigger a update query now? Yes, will it update the information? Will it trigger a update query now? Yes or no? Will it trigger a update query now? Sorry? See, this object is evicted. This POJO object is evicted. Okay, this POJO object is already evicted. That means it is removed from the, it is converted into a detached state. Okay, if it is converted into a detached state, okay, now, even if I commit 10 times or 20 times, will it be reflected in the database? Understood my question? I have evicted once, okay. Now, if I have evicted means that POJO object will be converted from persistent to detached state. Okay. Once it is converted from persistent to detached state, okay, whether I execute 10 commits or 20 commits, will it be will that information, okay, updated in the database or not? Now, in this case, okay, at last the name is Sudhir. Okay. With this Sudhir name will be updated in the database or not? Now, at the commit which is there at 27th line. What is the state of the object? At the 27th line, what is the state of the object P? Is it detached or is it persistent? Detached? Is it detached? Just see. Is it detached in the 27th line or is it persistent in the 27th line? But my question is, at the 27th line, when we are committing the information in the 27th line, is the session in a persistent state or is the session in a detached state? Sorry, is the POJO object in the persistent state or is it in the detached state? In the 27th line. It is in the? If it is in the detached state, will it execute the update query? No. Sorry. Oh, once it is committed, again we should begin the transaction. Is it executing the update query? Yes. Is it executing, Sudhir? Yes or no? Now, as a 27th statement or at 28th statement now, is the object there in the persistent state or a transient state? Persistent state. Whenever an object is associated with a session through any of the session methods, then it will become an object into persistent state. Now, can I convert now a transient object? A transient object can be converted into persistent. A persistent object can be converted into detached. Now, can I move a persistent object back to transient? Can I make a persistent object back to transient? Yes or no? Can I make a persistent object back to transient? It's not possible. If you remove that persistent object from the session, it will become a detached object. It's not possible to bring back a persistent object to a transient state. Okay? Once persistent object is brought to detached state, can we move? Can we bring back it to persistent state? Yes. By reassociating that object with the session. By reassociating that object with the session, we can bring a persistent object back to, we can bring a detached object back to persistent state. This cycle can happen in a number of times, based on the number of transactions that they are performing. It's possible to bring a detached state object to a persistent state by reassociating that object, POJO object with the session. By the save or SaveOrUpdate or to any other way. We reassociate that POJO object with the session, and it will be back to persistent from the state. This cycle can happen any number of times. Understood? Now, let's see something about the primary key fields that is configured in the Hibernate file. Right now we have given the primary key as assign. Okay. Now, if it is assigned means we are delegating the responsibility of generation of primary key to the application itself, to the Java application itself. Okay. Now, there are several other primary key generated classes. One of them is native. Then, if it is other than assign, okay, if the primary key value is other than assign, if the primary key generation class is other than assign, then we are telling that, okay, we are delegating the responsibility of generation of primary key to Hibernate framework. Then now in this case, Hibernate framework will take the responsibility of generation of the primary key. Okay. Now there are several other generation classes. We'll see one by one.
Yes, sir. And if you want to update the only by the name. Not by the primary key.
Then you should write some queries that we'll discuss as we go on. Okay. Then let me remove all these things as we have discussed earlier. Now let me remove all the information. Three rows are deleted. Let me commit it. So nothing is there in H1_person now. Let me try to insert them. Okay. Now what I am doing? What is the generator class? Native. Okay. Now if the generator class is other than assign, then we are telling to Hibernate that, okay, the generation of primary key is delegated to Hibernate. Okay. We are not supposed to generate the primary key then. Now, are we giving any value to the primary key? Are we giving any value to the primary key column? Yes or no? Yes. 300 is ID. ID is the primary key column. We have told Hibernate that you should generate the primary key, but we are giving a value to the primary key column. Understood? Let us see how it happens. Okay, insert into H2person, name equal to something and value equal to something. Now what is the value? Is it the name or is it something else? Is it the one that we have given or is it something else? Which is generated by Hibernate. But if Hibernate, if we delegate the request or if we delegate the responsibility of generation of primary key to Hibernate, then we should not do that. Sometimes, for some of the data types, it may give some exceptions. It will give some exception for data types like string and all. Okay, if the primary key column is of type string, sometimes it will give some exceptions. Okay, so better to take care that, okay, if the primary key generator class is other than assign, we should not give any value to that primary key column. Understood? So it will be auto generated. Now we execute the application again. It will be automatically sequentially inserted. Okay. Then there are several generated classes like native, increment, okay, just it is selecting the maximum ID from H1_person to insert. Increment means just it will increment maximum ID by 1. Okay, so first it is selecting the maximum of person ID, then based on the maximum value it is inserting the value. If the maximum is 3, then the next value it is will insert is 4. For that reason, it is selecting the maximum value. Understood? So, like that, Hibernate itself can generate a primary key. Okay? If you want to delegate the responsibility of generation of primary key to Hibernate, then we'll make the generator class as assigned and we'll do that. Understood? It's how it will behave. It's how the generator class will make a difference. But in general, if we delegate the responsibility of generation of primary key to Hibernate, we should not do that. Sometimes for some data types, exception will occur. Understood? So, we should not do that. Now, what is the value? What are the rows that are updated here? Will it update both the rows or none of the rows? Will it update both the rows or none of the rows? Will it update both the rows or will it update none of the rows or will it give an exception? Why it gives an exception? Understood the point here? What is the thing that we are missing here?
The ID.
ID. Okay. How Hibernate will update the information in the database? Based on the primary key value. Did we give any value to the primary key here? No. But on what basis will it update the information in the database? Okay. Now let us see. Okay, it's updating the information into HU person, set person name where person ID equal to null value. It will take a null value. But do we have any record with the person ID as null? No. So it's not updating any information in the database. It will not give an exception, but it will update nothing in the database. Nothing will be updated in the database. So the criteria for updation using Hibernate is the primary key value. Based on the primary key value only, Hibernate will update the specific record in the database. Now, if I set p dot set 1, then that particular row will be updated. Okay. Now, that particular row is being updated. Understood? That's how it will behave. And then what else? This one. And the next thing is we have seen insert, we have seen update, and the next thing is we need to see select. How to select information, a specific record or a bunch of records from the database. Okay, that we'll see now. How to select a bunch of records from the database, or how to select a specific record or a bunch of records from the database. Okay. Now to select a specific record from the database, okay, from a specific table. Okay, if you don't want to record, select multiple records, I want to select only a specific record. In person table there might be hundreds of person information, but I want to select the information of only one person. Let's consider like in the HCU database there might be records of thousands of students, but I want to fetch the information of only one student based on the student ID. Based on the student roll number, I want to fetch the information of only that student. Now, in any worst case, is there any chance that that student information will be duplicated? Student information will not be duplicated. While inserting itself, we take care that student information will not be duplicated. Can two students exist with the same roll number? But while inserting itself, we will take care that two students will not have the roll number, just because in that case roll number will be the primary case, so that there is no chance of insertion of two students with the same roll number. So in that case, for such kind of scenarios, okay, we'll be sure that we'll get only one row. In that cases, okay, we'll execute a method load. Load the information from person table, okay, with ID 1. Okay, what I am telling is the return type of load method is object. We need to typecast it into a person. The return type of load method is object. So since we need to have a person object, we need to typecast it into a person. The return type of load method of session is object. So we'll typecast it into a person. I am telling to Hibernate that please fetch the person information from the person table with ID 1. This is the primary key value. This load method is used to fetch a specific record. Load method is used to fetch a specific record based on its primary key. Now we are fetching the specific record from the person table with primary key 1. Understood what load will do? So now let me print the values. Now we need to commit plus or close, just because while updating only, okay, we'll commit or plus or plus the things. While fetching the records, we need not to flush or we need not to close. Sorry, we need not to commit or we need not to flush. Okay, now I'm executing get ID and get name. Now, is there any record with ID 1? Yes, is there the name Rajesh. So, select something from HO_ person where it's based on the person ID, where person ID equal to something. So, it's giving the value as 1 and Rajesh. Understood? Now, is the select query executed before this star or after this star? See, some select query is being executed here. Is that select query executed before this star or after that star? Before the system.println or after? When the select query is being executed? When the select query will be executed? After? Why? But when the person information will be loaded from the database? Understand my point? When the person information is loaded from the database? No. Are we beginning that? What, Sharat? What are you understanding? When we begin the transaction, at the time person information is loaded from the database. Is it the case? What I have asked? When the person information is loaded from the database. When we are loading it from the database? By executing the load method, we are loading the person information from the database. Just listen to the questions. Okay? And once the person information is loaded from the database, okay, once we execute the load method, okay. Now, what my question is, we are executing the load method at this statement, which is before the system.println. Then, will the select query executed before this system.println or after this system.println, which is stars? Before or after? Before. Understood the thing? Understood my question, everybody? See, we have executed the load method before this system.println with stars. Now, what my question is, whether the select query executed before this system.println with stars or after this? Understood my question? Will it be before or after? Is it executing before or is it after? Is it executing before the stars or after the stars? After. Why it is executing after the stars? Let's consider that. We are loading the person, okay, and we are not executing any getter methods of the person. Okay. Now, is the select query executed? No. Okay. Then, if we load the information from the database, okay, when exactly the select query will be triggered? If we access some attributes, then let me try to access some. Understood the thing? Understood the point here? Now, Malesh is telling that if you access some attribute, then it will be triggered. Then, is it triggered now? Is the select query triggered now? Even if you access the get ID? Is the select query triggered even if you access the get ID? No, when it will be triggered then? When we access the getter method of an attribute which is other than the primary key, then only the information will be fetched from the database. Okay? If we access an attribute which is other than the primary key, then only the information will be fetched from the database. Okay? Just because already we are providing the primary key here. So, while fetching the information, we need not to fetch the value of the primary key. Understood? Already we are providing this is the primary key value. So, while fetching the value of the primary key, we need not to fetch the information from the database. we should fetch the information from the database only we are retrieving some value which is not a primary key. Understood? Just because for load itself we are providing the primary key. That means already we know the primary key value. So why to execute a query when we execute the getter method of the primary key? It's not required. When we are actually fetching or when we are actually retrieving some information which is other than primary key, then only we are actually using that object. Understood? When we are getting some information which is other than primary key, then only the loaded object is said to be actually used. When the loaded object is actually used, then only the select queries will be triggered. Understood? See.
Not load based.
Load, I'll explain. Once if it is completed, then you can understand it better. Okay? Now, what will happen is when we load the object based on the primary key, and after loading the object, if we execute the getter method of any attribute which is not a primary key, then only the information will be selected from the database, the select query will be triggered. Until then, the select query will not be triggered. Just because if we are not using any information, let's consider like we have loaded the object but we have not used the object. In that case, is it useful to select the information from the database? Is it useful to fetch the information from the database? It's not useful just because we are not using that. Let's consider like we are executing the getter method of the ID in this case, which is a primary key. Okay? Is it required to fetch the primary key information from the database? No, just because already we are providing the primary key information here. So, if we are using something which is not a primary key, then only the information should be fetched from the database. This concept is called as lazy loading. Okay? This concept is called as lazy loading or lazy fetching. Or we can call it as even lazy fetching. That means fetching the information from the database only when non-primary key getter method is executed. Okay, and when we execute load method, what happens internally? Okay, what happens internally means the Hibernate session or the Hibernate framework will create a proxy object to person. Okay, Hibernate will create a proxy object to person. Hibernate internally, because of load method, it will create a proxy object to person. Proxy means it's something like a shadow object, shadow duplicate object. It's not duplicate, we can call it as a shadow object. It's not the actual object, but it's a shadow object, and that proxy or that shadow, we should not call it as shadow object in interviews. For your better understanding, I'm telling it as a shadow object, but actually it's a proxy object. When we execute the load method, Hibernate will create a proxy object which just have the primary key information, and that all the executions of that proxy object will be taken care by Hibernate. So if something happens to the proxy object, if some getter method is executed for the proxy object, okay, that will be filtered by Hibernate, that will be taken care by Hibernate, that will be known to Hibernate. See, Hibernate will create a proxy object, okay, and if any action happens on that proxy object, that will be known to the Hibernate. Let's consider like we execute a getter method, then that will be known to Hibernate. Yeah, on this proxy object, some getter method is being executed. So then on each and every getter method execution, Hibernate will evaluate, is it a primary key or not? If that represents a non-primary key, then what Hibernate will do? Hibernate will fetch the information from the database and populate into the object. And now that shadow object will become an actual object. A shadow or a proxy object will actually become an actual POJO object. Okay? Only when we execute a non-primary key getter method. Until then, till we execute a non-primary key getter method, it will act as a shadow object only. It will be converted, or it will be a normal POJO object only when if we execute a non-primary key getter method. Understood? Till then it will act as a shadow object. It will be a proxy object. Okay? When we execute non-primary key getter method, then the information will be fetched from the database and it will act as the whole POJO object. Actual POJO object. Understood? Why we should do all these things means performance. If we are not, until we are not using that object, why to load that object? Till we are not using that object, we should not load the object, which may increase the performance. Okay? Understood? How load method will behave internally? What is done internally in the load method? Now, what is the name in ID 1? Rajesh. Just I am setting the name to Mahesh. Okay. Now just I am not doing anything. I am loading. I am setting the name. Okay. Now let me execute this application. Just it is selecting the query. Let me do all these operations. Now, is Hibernate automatically updating the information? Did we execute any update method? Did we execute any update method here? Or did we execute any SaveOrUpdate here? Where it is? Did we execute any update or SaveOrUpdate here? Yes or no? No. Here, just see here. Did we execute any update or SaveOrUpdate here in these statements? No. Even if we are not executing update or SaveOrUpdate, how the update query is generated? How the update query is generated if we are not executing update or SaveOrUpdate? How the update query is being generated if we are not executing either SaveOrUpdate or update? Ideally, update query should be generated either we are executing update or SaveOrUpdate. But here, why the update query is generated? What happens in the proxy object? If you are modifying the name, what happens? Then, but why Hibernate should update the information? It's related to something that we have discussed just now. It's something to do with the concept that we have discussed just now, the previous thing. Just before that, before discussing about this load method, we have discussed something. It's something related to that. I clearly told that whenever we associate an object with Hibernate session, that object will be in a persistent state. Now, if we execute load method also, we are associating that POJO object with a session. Then, once the POJO object, either it's a shadow object or actual object, once it is associated with the session, then it will be in a persistent state. If we change anything in the persistent state, it will be automatically reflected in the database while committing. So we need not execute update here. Just we change the information and it will be automatically reflected in the database, just because that object is associated with the session and that is in the persistent state. Once that is in the persistent state, whatever we change, that information will be automatically reflected in the database. Because of that reason, the update query is being triggered. Understood? Understood? Understood?
So what if we don't commit?
If you don't commit, nothing will happen.
Second query.
Second query?
Second query.
The select query will be executed. But update query will not be executed until we commit. Insert or update. A DML operation will not be executed until we commit the transaction. Understood? Or is anybody confused with this? How it will happen? Once a POJO object is associated with the session by any mean, either by save or update or load or any mean, once Hibernate object is associated with the session, it is in the persistent state, so that any modifications will be automatically reflected in the database. We need not to explicitly execute update or save or update here. Understood? Okay. And there are several things to be discussed in Hibernate. Okay. Going forward, we will discuss them. Okay. We'll wind up here just because we have almost ended up with the topic. Rather than starting a new topic now itself, we'll start it tomorrow. Okay. And Saturday and Sunday I will be going to my home town, so there will not be any classes. If possible, within these weekdays, I'll try to have some classes in the evenings, so that we can compensate that loss. Okay, be ready for that. Okay, either Thursday, today's Wednesday, right? Probably tomorrow there might be a class. I'll inform tomorrow morning. There might be a class in the evening at 8:45 or like that. Okay, I'll inform you. There is a class tomorrow morning, but be ready for that. Okay, and Saturday and Sunday you don't have any classes.